one feature of the world's religions is a concern with the world's poor and the realization that their lives are as valuable as those in the more developed regions of the world like Europe and North America. And therefore, they can help to persuade us that we ought, if necessary, to be prepared to make sacrifices in order for the developed world to avoid the downside of climate change. And there's a certain self-interest in this, obviously, because we want to feel the rest of the world is developing as well, and we don't want to have uncontrolled migration driven by desperation, which will make already crowded parts of the world even more crowded. We've already moved over the course of evolution to a very interconnected society where we depend in any country on imports and interaction with many others. We depend on global networks. So we are all very interconnected. We're all on this crowded world together, and we need to realize that and guard its future. And we also need to realize that if you want to have greater equality in the world, and we're going to be in a world where there'll be 9 billion people by the middle of the century, then this constrains the kind of lifestyle people can adopt. It's not possible for 9 billion people to live like present-day Americans and have a sustainable world. But that's not necessarily bad news, because advances in technology are not always detrimental to natural resources. For instance, if we replace travel by IT and other communications, we can improve quality of life without exhausting more resources. So economic growth in the sense of improvement in quality of life can be achieved without an increasing consumption of raw materials. We can reduce what so-called energy intensification of the economy. And so it's not absurd to aim for a society by mid-century where there are 9 billion people who all enjoy a better quality of life than we do here in the West today, but without consuming nearly as much energy as we now do, and consuming that energy in a form that doesn't emit CO2 and doesn't have long-term consequences for the environment. So I think we can be technological optimists and hope that technology will be able to provide an infrastructure to enable all of us, the developing world as well as the developed world, to live a better lifestyle by 2050. But what we need is a political will and the long-term thinking that is prepared to plan more than 50 years ahead in terms of energy and natural resources. None of the developments which are needed in order to implement the United Nations goals will happen without the support of the political leaders, because they control the environment and the regulatory framework, etc. But although that is necessary, it's certainly not sufficient. And the political leaders, who in most countries have to be re-elected, will only push forward this agenda if it has broad support. And this is a problem, because for it to have broad support, the electorate has to think long-term and also think in terms of benefiting not just itself in the short run, but the world in the long run. And this is really rather hard. And this is where I think outside bodies, including the faith groups, can make a big difference, because they can make us aware that our lives will only be better in the future if the lives of everyone else in the world are better also, and we can have a less fragmented and less contentious world. And the faith groups can help to energize the public, and the public will then influence politicians, because politicians are influenced a bit by what experts tell them, but they're influenced far more by the press and by the postbag which they get from the public. And so I think those of us who are trying to campaign for an accelerated transition to clean energy and for concern about the developed world can do a better job if we don't just talk to politicians, though we should do it when we can, but also engage with the public and with the media, so that these topics rise higher on the agenda when they'd otherwise be trumped by short-term broker concerns.
Sort of creating
And the momentum can be sustained if people really care about the world their children and grandchildren will live in, and feel some obligation to ensure that the world is more stable, and the world won't be more stable unless all countries have protection against the real downsides of environmental change. We need to value the lives of people who will be living in the 22nd century as much as we value our own, and take precautions now and be prepared to make some sacrifices now to remove the risk from them. And we don't do that. All of us know how much we depend on the heritage left by centuries past. We in this country, Britain, benefit from what the Victorians did, etc., up to 150 years ago or more, and we ought to leave a legacy for the future which generations to come will not curse us for, but will bless us for. And I'm reminded of this when I go to a cathedral which was built many centuries ago by people who didn't live to see it finished, and they were living in a world when they thought the world had existed for only a few thousand years and might only exist for 1,000 more. We now live in a world where we know far more. We have horizons in space and time hugely greater than they did. But it's therefore rather shameful that our horizons are not as broad in space or in time as those of the cathedral builders. And we can at least learn from them that we ought to be thinking about preserving the world for future generations. And going back to the famous report produced by Brundtland, then the Prime Minister of Norway, about what's called sustainable development. And what was meant by that was development which leaves an equally good world for future generations. That should be our touchstone, rather than being happy about leaving a world for future generations which is denuded of many species and with a climate which people are not able to adjust to.